Hello, and welcome to the third and final episode of the winter season of the Public Health Insider. I'm Casey Farm. I'm the Director of Alumni Relations for the College of Public Health and Human Sciences at Oregon State University Alumni Association.
Hi, everyone. I'm Katherine Straubel. I'm Director of Marketing and Communications for the College of Public Health and Human Sciences at Oregon State. And in this episode of the Public Health Insider, we'll take a deep dive on current and future chronic health issues in kids and teens, and how an erosion in high-quality physical education, healthy eating habits, and many other external factors play a role. Most importantly, we'll talk about how parents and educators can continue to be positive advocates for young people's health and well-being.
Joining us is Megan McDonald, an associate professor and the OSU Impact for Life faculty scholar in the OSU College of Public Health and Human Sciences. Megan received a PhD in kinesiology from the University of Michigan in 2011. Her research interests are related to how motor skills and physically active lifestyles improve the lives of children and youth with and without disabilities. She has a specific research interest in the movement skills of children with autism spectrum disorder, including how to improve motor skills for children with autism and how motor skills interact with social communication skills.
Also joining us is Kathy Gunter. She is a faculty member in kinesiology and has a majority appointment in OSU Health Extension. She serves as director of the Healthy Lifestyles and Obesity Prevention Research Core at the Hallie E. Ford Center for Healthy Children and Families. Her research focuses on developing, implementing, and evaluating physical activity programs, and she has directed her effort toward individuals, families, and communities, child care environments, schools, and rural populations. She's currently the principal investigator on a 5-year federally funded project to understand the impact schools and communities make on physical activity and healthy eating behaviors in families and children, as well as childhood obesity.
Lastly, we are joined by Jenny Jackson, a clinical assistant professor of nutrition in the College of Public Health and Human Sciences, and the director of the OSU Dietetic Internship Program. She is also a registered dietitian, nutritionist, and a certified health and wellness coach. Jenny's research interests include community-based and epidemiological investigations focused on food security and the promotion of healthy eating and physical activity behaviors across the lifespan.
So just a reminder that our webcast series is hosted by the OSU Alumni Association in collaboration with the OSU Foundation and the College of Public Health and Human Sciences at Oregon State. Following the panelist presentation, we'll leave about 25 to 30 minutes for questions and answers. If you look now at the bottom of your screen, you'll find a Q&A button. Please, you're welcome to type questions throughout the talk. And at the end of the presentation, our panelists will answer as many of your questions as they can before the end of the episode.
All right, I think we're about ready to begin. I'd like to invite Kathy to join us by turning on her camera and microphone. We invite all of you to please enjoy the presentation, and we'll see you shortly for the Q&A portion of the program. Kathy, the floor is absolutely yours.
Thank you so much, Casey. I really appreciate it, and as do my fellow presenters. Let's see. All right, so when we were first approached about doing this podcast, the thought was that we would focus on the rise in child obesity in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. But we all actually agreed that that was not exactly what we wanted to talk about. We really wanted to talk about what's underpinning the rise in obesity rates. The obesity rates themselves are just a canary in the coal mine, if you will. What I mean by that is, coal miners would take canaries into the mines as a way to determine the safety of the mine environment. And if the canary died, the miners knew the environment was toxic and they needed to get out of that environment. So in this analogy of the canary in the coal mine, unusual changes in a health marker like obesity may be a signal that something is off in the environments that support child health. So this graph shows obesity trends from 2006 through 2018. They come from population level surveillance data. This is the black line. And they show how obesity rates rose from about 15.4% in 2006 to 19.3% in 2018. And then you see this sharp uptick in white. This is data from a different source. It's analysis of electronic medical records from over 430,000 individuals aged 2 to 19 who had assessments in doctor's offices in the year prior to the pandemic, and then multiple measures during the pandemic. In a nutshell, what they found was that was over 5 times as high during that pandemic than in the period preceding the pandemic. So, you know, this is our canary. This is the canary in the coal mine, and indicating that something is off in the environment. And the COVID-19 pandemic has dramatically altered the environments that support child health. Beginning in March of 2020, supports from schools, sports, recreation, social networks were altered, in some cases quite dramatically. And evidence shows that disruptions caused by school closures in particular led to behavior changes like less physical activity, more sedentary time, and unhealthy eating habits, which in turn lead to negative health outcomes, things that you've heard about probably in popular media, maybe the research, things like increased stress and anxiety and weight gain among all kids, you know, those canaries, if you will. So my area of research centers on physical activity promotion. And so my focus is on examining physical activity behaviors and environments. And even before the pandemic, we were in a crisis of inactivity. Only 27% of kids age 6 to 11 and 16% of older youth were getting the recommended levels of physical activity pre-pandemic. And while there haven't been population level studies of activity during or published reports during the pandemic, there have been lots of smaller studies and actually great systematic reviews that sort of aggregate the results of several smaller studies. And really universally across the board, what they're finding is that there's significant increases in sedentary time and even further declines in physical activity. And interestingly, and perhaps not surprisingly, kids 6 to 11 are exhibiting the greatest declines in physical activity and also the highest rate of change in the obesity rates. So what can we do? In the what can we do category, we can do what the National Institutes of Medicine proposed 10 years ago when we were having another obesity crisis, and that was to address the environments that support health behaviors. One of their proposed strategies was to make schools a focal point for obesity prevention. And I might alter that 10 years forward now to say make schools a focus point for health promotion. Why schools? There's lots of data, some from us, from many, many people, that schools are health supporting environments at the very least and have the potential to be incredible health promoting settings. Past research and certainly present circumstances show that regular exposure to the school environment is in and of itself a health promoting intervention for most kids, particularly the most vulnerable children who may not have other opportunities for supervised, unstructured, and structured play and physical activity, regular meals, and socialization. And right now in this moment, everyone has experienced the effects of not having access to the environments that promote health. So how do we make schools more optimal for all kids? We can talk much more about this when we get to the discussion phase, but some of the things that we know improves the amount of activity that kids get during the school day are optimizing physical education, providing physical education, recess, classroom activity, training teachers effectively, or better yet, hiring physical activity and physical education specialists to come in and provision these things. Advocate for activity infrastructure, simple things like changes in the playground environment to big things that might be school levies that add activity infrastructure. And then advocate for policies and practices. Again, big things and small things that promote physical activity and health. Something as big as Oregon's law that requires physical education minute minimums, and something as small as a wellness policy in your community school. So schools really are primed to be these spaces to help kids thrive in both their learning and their health. So I'm going to hand it off at this point to Jenny Jackson, who's going to talk some more about promoting positive eating behaviors.
Thanks, Kathy, and good evening, everyone. The psychological distress, isolation, financial difficulties, and schedule changes brought on by the pandemic understandably led to changes in our food habits. Many Americans were unable to access enough food to eat. Some of us ate healthier and some of us less healthy compared to pre-pandemic. Many kids and grown-ups gained weight, and that's okay. Regardless our eating habits, let's be gentle on ourselves. We've been doing our best to survive a pandemic, after all. It is concerning, however, that many kids and grown-ups have developed disordered eating behaviors. So focusing on body weight can perpetuate disordered eating and poor body image, which leads to other mental and physical health concerns. Instead, we can focus on how to support kids to establish or reestablish healthy relationships with food as we emerge from this pandemic. Because a healthy relationship with food is a prerequisite to healthy eating habits. But before we can promote positive eating behaviors in our kids, we grown-ups need to ask ourselves this question: are we competent eaters? And to answer that question, consider the following questions. Do you feel good about food and eating and feel good about feeling good? Do you take an interest in food and experiment with unfamiliar food? Do you trust yourself to eat enough for you? And do you take time to eat, to have regular meals and snacks and pay attention while you eat? If you answered yes to all these questions, you may be a competent eater. If you answered no to any of these questions, don't worry, you're not alone and there's nothing wrong with you. Thanks to the diet culture we live in, most of us have issues with eating at some point in our lives. That said, eating competence is at the heart of a good relationship with food. Eating competence means being comfortable and flexible with eating and being consistent about eating enough, enjoyable, and nourishing food. Even though competent eaters don't worry about what and how much to eat, they tend to do better nutritionally, be more active, sleep better, have better lab tests, and better parenting with food. They're also more self-aware and self-accepting, not only with food, but in all ways. Being a competent eater means being relaxed, self-trusting, and joyful about eating. Competent, attuned, and intuitive eating are all ways to describe flexible eating styles that focus on trusting hunger and fullness cues to guide when, what, and how much to eat. We're all born intuitive eaters. Think about how a hungry baby will cry until fed and then turn their head away when they're full. Likewise, children are fully aware of physical sensations of hunger and fullness. Yet when they receive messages that they can't possibly be hungry or they must eat everything on their plate, it erodes trust of their bodies and autonomy. Furthermore, somewhere along the way, as we all grow up, we unfortunately learn that some foods are, quote, healthy and we should eat lots of them, and other foods are, quote, unhealthy and should be restricted. This erodes our trust in food and enjoyment of eating. I'll be honest, it takes time and energy to learn how to eat intuitively. It's a process and practice makes progress. The beauty of it is that instead of following someone else's eating plan or rigid food rules, you decide when, what, and how much to eat. When it comes to our kids, we trust them to eat. Just like any other skill, be it learning to use a fork, learning to read or ride a bike, we trust that they will learn it eventually. Some days kids will eat a lot. Other days, not so much. One day they like a food, the next day they don't. The trick is to avoid any pressure on kids to eat certain types or amounts of food. Sooner or later, they will eat almost everything their grown-ups eat. Allowing kids to eat intuitively offers them a greater sense of self-esteem, understanding of boundaries, and connection to family during meal times. And they typically enjoy a greater variety of foods. Alternatively, controlling kids' eating can contribute to preferences for restricted foods and limit the acceptance of encouraged foods. Controlled eating can also disrupt internal hunger and fullness cues, limiting a child's ability to self-regulate the quantity and quality of food they eat. The result may be problematic eating behaviors that persist into adulthood. So how do you get started with teaching your kids to be competent eaters? Ellen Satter's division of responsibility encourages grown-ups to take leadership with the what, when, and where of feeding and give children autonomy with the how much and whether of eating. This includes letting kids eat until they're full, refraining from telling them to eat more or less, and believing them when they say they're full. This model applies at every stage of child development from infancy through adolescence. The idea is that when grown-ups do their jobs with feeding, kids will do their jobs with eating. It's a trust-based model and allows children to build autonomy. So next you may be wondering, what do I offer in those meals and snacks for my kids? First off, know that eating a variety of foods is a skill that children learn over time. It can take months, even years. If we grown-ups eat and enjoy a variety of foods, our kids assume they will eventually do the same. Make food available whenever kids are hungry, offer a variety of foods, including some that you know kids will like, both familiar and unfamiliar foods. Aim to include at least 3 of the 5 food groups in meals and snacks, and last but not least, include those forbidden foods, because forbidding or restricting certain foods only makes kids want them more. The goal is to help our kids understand there are no, quote, good or bad foods. I'll wrap up with some action steps that we can take in our homes, schools, and communities. Our kids look to us as role models. It's important for grown-ups to examine our own beliefs and behaviors around food. That said, you don't need to become an expert at intuitive eating in order to raise an intuitive eater. Any work you can do to heal your own relationship with food and body will have a positive effect on your family. For example, try to limit how often you express negative thoughts about food and bodies, because talking about weight and dieting is harmful for kids of all ages. This can be challenging because our culture sends constant messages about dieting, worrying about food, and eating the quote right way, when in reality, there is no one right way to eat. If you're concerned about your child not eating enough fruits and veggies or anything else for that matter, eat and enjoy your own food. Trust that your child will eventually do the same. Practice the division of responsibility in feeding. Again, adults do the what, when, and where of feeding, and children do the how much and whether of eating. Enjoy meals together as a family on a regular basis, and refrain from saying anything about kids' food choices. This means we avoid praising, cheerleading, pressuring, and bribing. I speak from experience when I say this can be really hard, so give yourself grace when you make mistakes. Pressure to eat is sure to backfire. So ask yourself, are you trying to get your child to eat more, less, or different food than they do on their own? If so, that's pressure. At school, we can promote the division of responsibility in the school environment, advocate for the provision of filling, well-timed sit-down meals and snacks, support your school nutrition programs, which provide access to healthy meals for all kids, including many who might otherwise go hungry, and advocate for food and nutrition education. This means letting kids learn about food by looking, touching, and tasting, omitting language about good or bad foods, weight or dieting, and teaching body positivity, because healthy people come in all shapes and sizes. And similar to what we can do in the school environment, we can be a positive force in our communities by promoting the message that all foods can fit into a healthful eating pattern. We can promote and role model body positivity by avoiding talking about anyone's body size or shape, even our own. And we can support efforts to increase food security so that all people at all times have access to enough food for an active, healthy life. Trying to do all these actions may feel overwhelming. Consider trying one and see where that leads you. The pandemic has caused more than enough stress in our lives. Food and eating are not meant to create more stress. They're meant to be enjoyed. And with that, I'll hand it over to Megan.
Thanks, Jenny. I am going to start by revisiting one of Kathy's earlier slides. The spike in childhood obesity since the pandemic was larger than anticipated. And of course, who could have anticipated that we would be engaged in a pandemic for 2+ years? While we don't have specific data on children with disabilities within this time frame, we do have historical perspectives which suggests that children with disabilities are generally less physically active than their peers without disabilities and more likely to be overweight or obese. So it's hypothesized that children with disabilities are facing more inequities in this respect. Higher increases in obesity and less physical activity than their peers without disability. Pre-pandemic, data suggested that generally speaking, children were 4 times less active than peers without disabilities and were more likely to be obese. Next slide. So there have been a lot of changes to policies and regulations in the past couple of years, but for lack of a better term, we're getting back to base. And as we get back to base, it's important to consider some of the public laws that provide equitable access points to physical activity and physical education for all students. As Kathy mentioned, in crisis, there is an opportunity. And as we get back to base, it's a reminder to revisit some of the overarching policies that were somewhat sidelined early in the pandemic as we sought to figure things out. In the United States, education is guided federally by the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA. This is the overarching federal public law in education. While other related public laws preceded ESSA, the designation of physical education as a part of a well-rounded education was enacted in December 2015, when the Every Student Succeeds Act was established. The key message here is that the act is focused on all students, including students with disabilities. Notably, next slide, please. Notably, the overarching law guiding special education services in the US is the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, or often referred to as IDEA. This law ensures special education services for children between birth and 21 years old. Within IDEA, it's indicated that physical education is a direct service for students with disabilities. I want to reiterate this because it's often misinterpreted. Physical education is a direct service. This means it can't be substituted with something else like physical therapy or occupational therapy. I anticipate we might be able to discuss this more in the discussion as well. For parents on this webcast, you can advocate for PE on a student's individualized education plan, or often referred to as an IEP. This will include specific measurable goals like specific skills associated with games your child might be interested in playing. Special education also includes transition services. Transition services are common for students in special education starting sometime between the ages of 14 and 16 years old. It varies by state law. And it focuses on transitional skills for students after high school, like skills that we all use in community life. Physical education, or PE, can and should be included in the student's transition service plan. So within a transition service plan, PE might be more aligned with community-based practices, like sport clubs or fitness facilities. In other words, physical education might not be taking place in the traditional gymnasium that's located at the high school, but might be more aligned with the specific interests that the student has, like local recreational or sport activity leagues. Next slide. While there continues to be work to do, the focus of special education and PE within these services for children with disabilities is on equity. These services work when the supports necessary for the student are present. This might mean additional support staff to provide equity for a student, specialized equipment, individualized instructions, or variations to rules and regulations for a particular game or activity. Next slide. Finding your passion and interest around physical activity should be fun. When students try something out at school and want to continue to pursue it, we often look to the community for programs. There are federal laws pertaining to access for people with disabilities, but these are often interpreted in the physical sense. For example, ramps leading to entrances or wide or really accessible restrooms. But I would argue that a community's commitment to inclusion includes trained staff and inclusion specialists. You can advocate for this within the community programs and spaces your child is interested in learning more about. Next slide. The National Center for Health and Physical Activity has a wealth of resources for individuals, businesses, and communities. I would highly encourage your perusal of it. Next slide. So here are some of the things that we can do. All of the recommendations by Kathy and Jenny apply to all children and families. We can always adapt and break down tasks to make them more accessible to some people with disabilities. I would encourage families to advocate for inclusion and ensure that physical education and health are embedded in your child's individualized education plan and transition service plan. As a community, it's critical to embrace inclusion. And I am going to pass this off to Casey for the Q&A, Casey and Catherine, excuse me, for the Q&A session.
Thank you, Megan. Love it. We'd love to have all of our panelists turn their cameras on and unmute themselves so we can have the Q&A portion. Absolutely fantastic stuff. I have all sorts of notes here. And I want to remind those that are watching right now, you have the Q&A button. Make sure to type in your questions into the Q&A button so we have the ability to kind of go through and ask each of our panelists. I want to start off though, Jenny, this is something like myself. I was labeled a picky eater when I was a kid, and that it was a point of contention when I was growing up. So I love listening to your talk. My poor mother has so much guilt since I became an adult many years ago, and talking about all the different things. So I really love that this message is kind of getting out. And one of the first things I really wanted to kind of ask you about is how, you were talking about intuitive eating, you were talking about teaching those things to kids. How important is it for kids to have an understanding also about where food comes from, and then also cooking and being a part of that process within the kitchen? Is that kind of a component of it as well?
Yeah, great question. So when I talked just briefly about supporting or advocating for food and nutrition education, it's sort of going to graduate like everything else as kids go from young children to older kids. And so it's really starting with just the eating and the tasting and the touching of foods. And then as kids get older, junior high, high school, you can start introducing more of the nutrition piece of the education. But back to your question, I think it's never too early there are things that very young children can do in the kitchen, right? And I won't spend time going into those details, but certainly getting kids involved in whether it's growing food, going to the grocery store and helping pick out food if that's feasible for you, and then helping with cooking. Anytime they're involved in any part of the preparation, they're going to be more likely to try that food. I love your point about where do foods come from, and so that often can be taught in elementary age as well. So those are definitely components of the larger package of food and nutrition education.
And never too early to start. I mean, obviously, if you're trying to make a souffle, you're probably, having a 6-year-old help you with your souffle might go a little bit awry, but
you could have the 6-year-old put the cheese in the souffle. There's just different, but there's knife skill, safety, and all that sort of thing. But start, as soon as they show interest, give them a job.
Thanks, Jenny. Appreciate it.
I'd like to transition to Megan for just a minute. I know I was telling her before this started that I have a son who gets special education services, and learning about putting them in our transition plan and having them in the IEP was just incredibly helpful. I don't know that was something that was really suggested, that you have to be a good advocate for your child. One of the questions we had was, so what if the school suggests substituting PT or OT for PE, like actual PE?
Yeah, so this actually comes up quite a bit, and often physical education is misinterpreted in individualized education plans. But what's really clear is that IDEA, which was reauthorized in 2004, clearly defines physical education as a direct service. Services like physical therapy or occupational therapy are not direct services. And so they actually can't be substituted for PE, but it's not uncommon for schools to sort of make these suggestions. So it's really important to understand, and these letters of clarification have come forward from the US Department of Education as well. So there are mandates that more clearly state this, but it's also important to sometimes have that information and advocate in that case. So PT and OT, we would call it related services. So there's still services that children should have access to if that's something that they need as a part of their individualized education plan. But PE, on the other hand, is a direct service. So just like all of the other kids in school, PE, should be accessed regularly. Thanks for the question.
Yeah, there was another one related. I'll just follow up. Someone asked, should we create highly accessible movement-based programs for children ages 0 to 5 who present with high ACE scores, ASD, DD, and maybe explain some of those acronyms to people who may not know?
Yeah, so the autism spectrum disorder, developmental delay, or developmental disability. And so ACEs is one of the ways that we just sort of screen for some of those characteristics. So it's an assessment that professionals use out of curiosity in terms of developmental delays that children might have. So one of the things, so the answer is absolutely yes. Highly movement embedded in these programs is really key. And actually with really young children, movement is not only important for physical activity, but it's also how we learn and explore our environment. So it's also very highly linked to cognition, social skills, interactions, learning how to be reciprocal in terms of playing a game or passing something back and forth. And sometimes that can be really tricky in certain childcare spaces, depending on size, but I would really encourage early childhood educators or providers to think about the space that they have and how to move things around to have time for children to play, and especially going outside. I mean, that's something that we've learned pretty substantially in the past couple of years. It's always been there, it's always fun, and we even know that it's extra safe and with lots of opportunity to move. So yeah, that would be encouraged.
One thing about physical activity and sport, I found it sort of as an equalizer. It brings all kids to the group, and it kind of helps enable participation from all people. And I think, his peers have learned from early on too. They sort of adopt that equity and inclusion. And yeah, I've been really impressed, at least with his peers here in Corvallis. It's been pretty wonderful to see that.
Yeah, I'm really happy to hear that. And I think the playground too, like if we think about the playground as sort of this social world for students, when we think about what happens on the playground, especially in those early years, I mean, it's a lot of activity. So learning some of those skills in respect to how to participate in some of those activities can be really helpful with other aspects of social skills and just hanging out with friends. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I want to go back to the chart. Kathy, you had it early on in your presentation. I know, Megan, you did a kind of a revisit of that chart and that 3.1% jump. And we had someone in the chat that wanted a kind of a clarification with that 3.1% jump between 19 and 20. Do you know when that was taken? Because the pandemic obviously started here in the US, I mean, really heavily getting lockdowns in March 2020. So was that taken at the end of 19 and at the end of 2020, like midway through? Do you know kind of when in those 2 years when that jump occurred from the data?
Yep. Yeah, I do have. The data reflected on the graph are very specific to the proportion of children who were identified as obese in August 2019, and then in August 2020. So really, this is looking at effects that are attributable to, as this individual said in the chat, the very early phases of the pandemic. So, it's going to be really interesting to see what the surveillance data look like that will cover the 2-year period. Those, when those come out, that really capture the full breadth. So this is really just which is why sort of we refer to it as the canary in the coal mine. It's such an unusual change in the pattern that we typically see.
Yeah, I have to, not trying to assume what the data will look like. I'm sure that that's still kind of being gathered, but given the fact that that was only within the first 5-6 months, that I'm sure you all are kind of a little bit wary of seeing what it's going to look like over the next year or two, and as we're kind of transitioning hopefully into endemic times and going forward, that there might even be pretty more sizable jumps for August 2021 than in August 2022.
Yeah, it's certainly very possible. And, you know, as Megan alluded to, there are going to be vulnerable populations who already have higher, you know, I don't have more significant detrimental health outcomes on a variety of markers, not just obesity. And, you know, so the ramifications for those children are going to be even more dire.
I think too, just to piggyback a little bit off of what Kathy's saying, you know, one example that I sometimes use in my classes with students, and we're talking about children today, but I'm a professional in kinesiology. I'm an associate professor of kinesiology, and I know the value of physical activity. I've dedicated my life to this career, and it's hard to get out and be active sometimes. And so if it's hard for me, and it's been harder for me the past couple of years, especially really early on in the pandemic, like how is it for other people? I mean, I think Jenny alluded to this earlier too, like speaking from experience, right? So I do think, yeah, I think it's just important to think about that and to also be creative and think about some of the advice for moving forward for physical activities for kids.
And I think too, that's why it's so important to take the onus off of individuals, right? I mean, we know in some of the work, you know, that Jenny and I actually did together, we actually measured physical activity levels of children during the school day over, you know, a typical school week. And kids are getting, you know, 18 minutes of health promoting physical activity over the course of a 6.5-hour school day. And these, you know, this was almost 2,000 children that we looked at. And so, you know, that means, like, you know, if I'm a parent that's concerned that my child's not getting the recommended 60 minutes of physical activity, then all of a sudden the burden is on the parents to provision that. So if we can optimize school environments to ensure that kids are getting that activity while they're there, I mean, that really is kind of sharing the burden of our child level health, and really that's what we know that we need to be doing. So it's not an individual's responsibility per se. Children can't make decisions about, you know, when they're going to be active and exactly what they're going to do. They don't have that sort of volition. So all of us need to make sure that the environments that they're in are supporting their ability to do that.
So speaking of the environment, someone had asked if you had any tips on how they could get funding for before or after school physical activity programs. Like, is there anything parents can do about this?
You know, that's such a big thing, right? It's so community specific and community contextual. Relationship, and also what's available. Are there partners who can provision things like that, like the Boys and Girls Club? You know, we're very lucky here in Corvallis. So I don't think I have a really good answer for what parents can do for that, other than sort of advocate for the need, and then you know, work with schools to try to enable those actions.
Okay.
You know, Jenny, we have to navigate, and by we, I mean the collective we, the societal we have to navigate a lot of different kinds of diet fads, and especially with like social media and all of that. You know, this is kind of like a two-part question, you know, especially for kids and their mental and emotional health, and trying to navigate you know, healthful eating in a social media world. The first thing I kind of want to be able to ask is, one of the things that seen is both in adults and with kids is intermittent fasting. And so I don't know how much you know about it, but you know, and I feel comfortable talking about it, but I'd love to kind of hear about it, because I think that's one of the many things that's being talked about. Like, really, what is that? And the second part of that is breakfast. You know, it seems like is it important? Is it not important? You know, it seems like to be the one that consistently gets skipped or can be cut out of your day. And, you know, it used to be like the most important meal of the day, I think. But also some people are like, oh no, it's no problem whatsoever. I'm doing some fasting. So I'd love to hear you talk about that for both kids and for adults.
Oh gosh, those are big questions. Fortunately, my hairstylist just asked me last week the intermittent fasting question. So I did provide the disclaimer that I'm not an expert in intermittent fasting. And I also let her know up front that I am a non-diet dietitian. So that's where I'm coming from in my response. Um, so, you know, how do I explain this briefly with intermittent fasting? Um, Well, the reason people lose weight is because they're eating less. So that's the bottom line with all of these diets. My hairstylist asked, well, you can't possibly lose weight if her husband was wanting to do intermittent fasting. If I'm eating burgers and fries the whole time during that time when I can eat, and then then that's not going to work. And I would beg to differ, because when you are limiting the amount of time that you can only eat so many burgers and fries before you're full. So it does end up coming right back down to a calorie restriction, which causes any sort of weight loss. The evidence shows that in the short term, people can lose weight. Unfortunately, with any diet, I think it's 99% of people gain the weight back, particularly if they lose weight quickly in the short term. And it's just not something that is a lifestyle in terms of sustaining that. It just doesn't really fit for most people to be able to do fasting for long periods of time. So there's that answer. Sort of. And then let me see. Then about breakfast. So there's a lot of good evidence to support that breakfast is tied to lots of different benefits, including the tendency to eat better throughout the day if you've started with breakfast. And there have been some studies done on breakfast and academic outcomes for kids who are better ready to learn when they get to school. I would say likely the same thing happens for we adults when we start our day off with something. If you think about breakfast, back to your intermittent fasting question, you have just fasted over the night of whatever time period that is while you're sleeping. So it's important to restart your metabolism and fuel your body to get started. And it doesn't, people can eat breakfast breakfast is really the first meal of the day. So it doesn't have to be right when you roll out of bed, but it is a great way to start the day.
And I like that you tied about the importance of learning and kind of getting ready to go there. Like
Yes.
if kids are really missing it, like if they're hungry, they have a
Yes.
much tougher time to really, like, first couple periods of the day, you want to be able to absorb, and you're probably losing out quite a bit if you're hungry.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's where I think I mentioned the importance of trying to get 3 of the 5 food groups, or if you're used to thinking about macronutrients, 2 of the 3 macronutrients, carbohydrate, protein, and fat, so that you're getting a combination of nutrients that are going to sustain and stick with you for a while until your next opportunity to eat. So thanks for the questions.
Thank you.
So I'm sitting here thinking about my own habits over the pandemic, and some good, some maybe not so good, but I love how you're all encouraging us each to give each other grace and give ourselves grace, because I really do think that's super important, because we all know mental health has also suffered as a result of the pandemic for ourselves and our kids. So if for those of us who may have some bad habits or need to pick up some better habits, like, what are some real, like, tangible, I mean, it seems overwhelming, like, oh, I'm just going to eat better, I'm going to start exercising. Like, do you have some tangible tips for people who maybe need to start back in building a newish normal? I know we hear that a lot, but what would you say?
Yeah.
Go
ahead, Kathy.
Okay. I was just going to say that, the physical activity guidelines for Americans, one of their primary recommendations is to move more and sit less. And, that's an easy place to start. And because I think people who are not kinesiologists or dietitians, they hear the word exercise and it feels like very specific, and like I have to sweat and I got to change my clothes and I have to do all these things. But in reality, We know that if you just are making active choices throughout your day, and it's, people have heard this before, and I know they're going to be like, oh yeah, but the reality is that as the more that we can reduce our sedentary time and just increase activity in the course of our sort of daily habitual activity, you know, walking to school or biking to school or work, if you can do that, that is an amazing way to start. You know, go for walks with your family, walk the dog for 5 minutes longer than you were walking the dog before. Speaking of dogs and pandemic, my husband asked me to ask either Megan or Jenny the question about, there's data that came out saying that dogs, we would think that dogs would be healthier over the pandemic, but people are giving them more treats. And so they're actually getting heavier as well. Like if you, that's my bit of levity around like behavior change. It's not just us, it's really sort of a species wide problem.
I had a colleague just tell me about that the vet was like, stop feeding your dog so many treats because you're home all the time. And I've noticed it, like my step count is ridiculously bad when I work from home because I just sit all day and work, compared to when I'm on campus and I'm walking from building to meetings and walking to my car. It is just shocking how few steps I take during the day.
Which is a perfect example of why just daily activity can really make a big difference.
Yeah.
Yeah. And oh, go ahead, Catherine.
Sorry. Yeah, you made a good point too, because I was one of those people who thought, oh, exercise means this, right? And it does and it doesn't. All those little things, yeah, they add up. So that has definitely been an important lesson.
Yeah, and I think to reiterate, my step count also changed pretty substantially. So I also track my physical activity. I'm sure that's a surprise. but actually at the very beginning, I biked to work. I only lived 2 miles away. So it's not a real bike ride. But when I started working from home initially, I was like, oh, I'm really not making sort of some of these regular activity counts that I typically make. And at that time, I had to think about being more intentional about physical activity. And so I would also really encourage that for kids as well. And walking, like really just walking. And now there's so many great ways to do that. I mean, I think that we all probably at some point went down like the podcast, you know, listening. There's ways to sort of walk and listen to a podcast or walk and listen to a meeting. And for kids too, like to walk and talk. And sometimes those are some great conversations. Sometimes I have the best conversations when I'm not actually facing someone. You know, you're walking and talking and it's just kind of organic, and making that a part of your family activity, whether it's after dinner or before school. And there are other things too. You know, really simply, as it was discussed, like thinking about some of these environmental pieces, parking a little further away. You know, you don't have to make a drastic change immediately. It's just a little change every day or a little change every week. And all of a sudden, before you know it, like that's a bigger part of your activity for the day. So I would really encourage starting small and building up. And if there's a setback, that's okay. I think that's also really important for adults and for kids, that setbacks are really normal, and that sort of resetting, reevaluating, and rethinking like what's important and what's fun for physical activity is really helpful.
And if you park a little bit further away, less potential for dings and dents into your car, because it's right. So there's that benefit as well. I want to kind of transition and talk in about green spaces, and there's a lot of different ways in which that we can kind of go with green spaces. All three of you can touch on that. I kind of want to start with you, Megan, in the sense that here in Oregon, I live in a community where on the local ballot, there were two factions who were talking about access to green space. And you had one that was very much on the conservation side, wanting to make sure things were preserved and untouched, and again having the best of intentions in like having access to it, but doing as little as human intervention or damage as possible. And on the other hand, you had people who wanted to have more paved paths, you know, so individuals have better access to green spaces. And so for those that are, again, both really well intentioned but had a very fierce ballot measure. And so talk a little bit about like access to green spaces, and especially, with varying different levels of abilities, and where can we really strike that balance? Is there really something as far as when we're talking about that, and how it relates to getting out and being more active?
Yeah, well, I think in Corvallis, we're so lucky with all of the green spaces that we do have that are very accessible, and then other spaces that are really inaccessible, but with opportunities for accessibility. So a long time ago, I really sort of inclusion is very important to me. It's a value that I hold really highly. And in my 20s, doing some work with people with disabilities, I really sort of reevaluated what exactly inclusion meant in this respect. And I ultimately arrived, it's about having the same opportunities within the same space. And so we can take some of the places around Corvallis where actually the options are numerous. You can run on single track, trails if that's where you want to go, and you park at the same place, or you can sort of wheel or walk or run on paved paths as well. And so that opportunity was really there. And I think in some ways striking the balance, but to ensure that there are options for accessibility or physical accessibility in those spaces as well. We can talk about accessibility more holistically too. So maybe it's having a friend with you when you go out to do some of these activities, or a reminder about how to play a certain sport, or a peer mentor that's kind of encouraging, or like really like learning the game with you. And that can also be about accessibility. But I really think a balance of both is important, and having opportunities within the same community so that we're thinking about inclusion from that perspective. So I don't know if I gave a great answer, but balance and like multiple options, I think, is where I would land on that one.
No, yeah, absolutely. And I think it's also about being open to the discussion and realizing that no one side is right and no one side is wrong, and trying to find that balance. And as you talked about, like, Corvallis has a nice place, but has nice access to green spaces, but many communities do not, and it's very inequitable, depending on the neighborhood or the part of the community in which you are. If that is something, if you are really wanting to be involved with having the passion for green spaces, Megan, especially for access, and your community doesn't really have it, I don't know, like where would you start as far as an advocacy piece is concerned? Would you start with like the local parks department? Would you try to go to local leaders? Like, if you're really passionate about that, like from your standpoint, in where would you start?
Yeah, so I think starting locally and really learning what's out there and becoming more in tune with local advocates, and also working to sort of create advocates as well. And then, of course, the Americans with Disabilities Act, there are some specific regulations, especially as we talk about physical space. And so, and I think really, expanding that a little bit. And one of the things that I often talk about is there's accessibility, and then there's accessibility with dignity. And so those, in my opinion, are two very different things. So having a playground that's fully accessible for all children is very different than having a playground with one small accessible space. And so I think that we're all really leaning into that right now, but I would definitely start locally. And then the other thing is that public spaces, when we talk about public community spaces, schools are included in that. And so schools do have to meet some of these other regulations in terms of adhering to the Americans with Disabilities Act, as well as all of the other inclusive pieces of, that community and space. And so those would be some other starting points for children in the community too.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I know we're starting to wrap up the rest of the evening. Katherine, I certainly had one more question, but if you have something, I wanted to make sure that you got it in as well.
Go ahead.
Okay. As we're kind of winding up, I really appreciated how each one of you in your PowerPoint presentation talked about action items and things that people can do, and some takeaways. I'd love to hear a little bit more if you want to expand on some of the ones that you presented, if you didn't have a chance to include something that you think would be good for our audience to kind of go forward with, because that's one of the things about this series of the Public Health Insider is really next steps in what families can do, what individuals can do on our topics. And so I'll open up to any one of the three of you if you'd like to add anything new or expand upon. But again, like what people can do kind of going forward, again, to be good positive advocates for kids, for children, for teens, for themselves, on all these fronts that we've been talking about tonight.
I was curious as Megan and Kathy were talking and did such a great job of talking about the school environment, but as a parent of a young child, wondering what are things that we can do at home to be active together or to promote my child being active.
Yeah, I think, some of the things, especially being home together so much, right? Recently, getting outside together is a really important way to be physically active. There's a lot of research showing the benefits of being, in the outdoors in general, and then it's a great space for activity. So after dinner walks, schedule those in, or, even a dance party, spontaneous dance party. I mean, I have a teenager and, much to her horror, we still, I still do that. And, if you're a family, you're just moving your bodies. And then quite honestly, if you have kids, if they have, video game, things that are active video games, and that's a way for them to be active with them, support those kinds of behaviors in all of the ways.
Yeah, I echo that too. I think being present and being active with kids is really helpful, even if it's just for a part of the time that they're outside or that activity. Soccer was the big one at our house. We spent a lot of time on the soccer field. I had to draw on some, late 90s soccer skills that were not quite developed, but it was fun. And actually, it was also really important, I think, to see that I'm not perfect at this either, and this is really fun for us to do together. And then I think also creating that opportunity to as you were talking about, Jenny, in your presentation too, there is something, maybe the kids can plan oh, this is the activity that I want to do, or Friday night's your night, what activities are we doing together as a family, and providing some choice in that too.
Megan, when you say that, it reminded me, so for a long period of time, my daughter got into horseback riding, which, I was sporty spice all growing up, hence my interest in physical activity, right? But horseback riding, no, I had no idea. I knew nothing about it. I had a healthy fear of these very large animals. But I would take her to these lessons and I would sit there and they would say words that didn't make any sense to me. I didn't, and the person would say, "Oh, good job." And I couldn't understand what was happening. So I took lessons too. And I did that with her. And I learned something incredibly new. I learned where I have some muscles that weren't getting used. I can tell you that. So that's, we don't all have those same, the capacity to do that. But if you do, even if it's not your lane, sometimes you might find, your world sort of opens up by having those experiences. I definitely learned things.
Awesome. I'm definitely a big fan of the kitchen dance parties. It is a little embarrassing. I got a record player within the last year and I dug out all my records from high school. So yeah, I'm sure the teenagers are completely mortified, but it keeps them, I don't know, on their toes. So I think we're out of time, aren't we, Casey? So unfortunately, this has been so interesting. We could have asked you lots more questions. One of our guests noted that today is National Registered Dietitian Day. So I just wanted to give an extra shout out to Jenny Jackson.
And I would say that the person who made that shout out is a former OSU graduate from our master's dietetic internship program. So right back at you, Caitlin.
Yeah.
Thanks for showing up tonight.
That's awesome. Your message, all of your message, were really, really good, really practical. We really appreciate your time and for sharing your knowledge, your passion, and just really for all the work that you do to help ensure a healthy future for kids of all ages and abilities. I need to add that if you'd like to learn more about the research and collaborative work that was discussed tonight, we have a slide up on the screen that directs you to where you can learn more. This includes the Hallie E. Ford Center for Healthy Children and Families, the OSU Extension Service, the Moore Family Center for Whole Grain Foods, Nutrition, and Preventive Health, and the college's Impact Program.
This was the final episode of the winter season of the Public Health Insider series. The series will be returning for its spring season here in a couple of months. Please stay tuned to the series site, which you can see right here on the screen at fororegonstate.org/PHI, which stands for Public Health Insider, for updates on upcoming episodes. You can also catch up and share on any episode from this past winter season that you may have missed, or even to rewatch, including tonight's episode once it's posted.
So another option is that we'll be posting the video from tonight's episode on the college's YouTube channel. You can just search for the college on YouTube, and it will also be on our news site, Synergies, which is synergies.oregonstate.edu.
Each attendee will receive an email from me tomorrow that will include items for more ways for you to connect to OSU, including a brief survey about tonight's event and episode. We greatly appreciate if you could take the moment to fill it out so we can continue to bring you the programming from the college and the Oregon State University Alumni Association that you are interested in.
Casey and I thank you for joining us tonight, and we look forward to hosting each of you again when the series starts again this spring. Until then, I hope you all have a wonderful evening. Thank you.